Hello, Music 12. We're going to jump straight in this week to our video lecture for Chapter 6. Again, I encourage you to go along with the homework questions with the lecture slides open so that you can follow along with me and read along as we go through Chapter 6. This is a great chapter and it relates to our first project, Project 1, which is all about program music. The idea of program music on a basic standpoint is music that tells a story without the use of words or lyrics. It's only about the music portraying these emotions, but not just emotions, but storytelling devices, right? So we're going to check out this chapter and jump straight in here. Over the course of the past 3 chapters, we have examined a variety of musical forms and works that communicate narratives. These have included examples that rely on stage action, such as opera and ballet, and examples that incorporate a sung text. In this chapter, we will encounter music that tells a story without that aid of staged action or performed text. This music will use sound alone, perhaps supplemented by a written explanation, to communicate with the listener. The question here today is, but how can sound tell a story? How can we know what music is about without seeing the story acted out or hearing the story told through words? In many ways, music is handicapped as a storytelling medium, for it cannot be specific. Sound cannot tell us the name of a character, or provide details about a dramatic setting, or convey dialogue, or even communicate a plot of any complexity. At the same time, sound can also be a particularly powerful storytelling medium. Because of its potential to provoke emotions in the listener, it can tell compelling stories on the emotional and psychological level. Music can also incorporate the sounds that would be heard in a specific setting or that might accompany a sequence of events, thereby recreating the aural experience of a story. In general, music is able to communicate specific content using 3 techniques. While these have been primarily exploited in the European concert tradition, they are not unique to Western music. The 3 techniques are mimesis, quotation, and the use of musical topics. After an introduction to each in turn, we will see them at work in a variety of examples. So know these 3 terms, mimesis, quotation, and musical topics. We'll be using them throughout the chapter, and also a great set of vocabulary words to use potentially for your project number 1. Here's the first one, mimesis. Mimesis is the simplest technique and also the most common across traditions. In cases of mimesis, music imitates real-world sounds in order to call elements of the physical world to mind. These sounds might include birdsong, animal cries, trains, explosions, footsteps, anything that makes noise, really. Mimesis can be used to create a dramatic scene using sound alone. So, for example, when we see the bird here, you can imagine a flute player maybe plays something specifically that sounds like a bird song. This is more direct mimicry of sounds that we already know. When they say an explosion, what instruments could do that? Maybe a large gong, a huge metal disc, right? That can act as that explosion sound. It's not truly an explosion, but it mimics that sound. The next one is quotation. In the case of quotation, one piece of music incorporates a passage from another. Quotation can be used in many different ways. Sometimes the quoted music will have a text that the listener is expected to know. In this way, a composer can include specific dramatic content without employing text directly. Other times, the quoted music can be understood as part of a scene. So like we're saying here, literally we're taking music from another existing work and putting it or transplanting it into another piece of music. This happens all the time, and we'll see a couple examples in today's chapter later on. The example they give us here, the American composer Charles Ives quoted the music of Wagner in his piano composition, Concord Sonata. His intent was to recreate the living room of the Alcott family, with Louisa May playing her favorite tunes at the piano. So he's really trying to evoke a specific scene by imagining a family room, essentially, where someone is playing the piano. So he's pulling another piece by Wagner into his sonata, the Concord Sonata, to give this impression of a family room type setting. This is probably the best way to think of quotation. It's literally just like how we do in writing an essay. We quote from other authors. The last one is musical topics. When a composer employs musical topics, they refer to recognizable musical styles or cliches in order to communicate with the listener. Some musical topics are associated with specific genres or traditions, such as military marches, waltzes, or Christian hymns. Upon hearing one of these styles referenced in a musical work, the listener might think of an army, or a ball, or a church service. In this way, the composer can transport an audience to a specific place. So when we say musical topics, we're basically saying that there's kind of not generic music, but music that is so reminiscent of the music that we might hear in a church or the music that we would hear at a dance, that as soon as you activate that switch, it takes your audience's mind, the listener's mind, to those places without having to even reference it. The music takes us to those places. Let's continue here. Other musical topics rely on the use of standardized techniques to portray specific scenes, such as a storm, or a romantic tryst, or shepherds tending their flock. This approach builds on the tradition of music for the theater. An operatic love scene, for example, is usually accompanied by slow, sweeping gestures in the strings, while shepherds appear to the accompaniment of droning bagpipes, usually imitated by other orchestral instruments because the bagpipes are not part of the normal orchestra. So oftentimes this is the flute and the double reeds, the oboe or the English horn, that are used to mimic the sound of this instrument. So again, by mimicking the sound of a bagpipe using other instruments, you're transporting your listeners to the sounds of the highlands, or maybe to an open green pasture with shepherds tending their flocks. It reminds us of the countryside, and composers have done this across different types of art, music. Last paragraph here. Musical topics often incorporate mimesis, although the technique is more complex. Hunting scenes, for example, were long set to music that used mimetic techniques to imitate the sounds of horses galloping and hunting horns blasting. So again, this is mimesis, imitating the sounds of hoofs galloping through the rhythms of the trumpets, maybe. The hunting horns, just hearing those trumpets and French horns really conjures up the hunting music that we would use in a real setting. People used to hunt, uh, on their horses and play horns to scare the animals. Let's continue here. The imitation of hoofbeats is an example of mimesis, but the hunting topic is associated not only with the sounds of hunting, but also with the tradition of writing hunting music. The storm topic provides a similar example. While rapid chromatic scales, dynamic swells, and sudden accents can imitate wind blowing through the trees and lightning striking the ground, we recognize storm music primarily because we are familiar with the long tradition of this type of music being used to accompany storm scenes in opera, films, and also cartoons. So musical topics is a huge area. There are so many examples that we can get into. We'll look at a couple in the chapter. Now, this is the big word for today, I would say, is program music. In the European tradition, instrumental music that claims to tell a specific story or to otherwise communicate the extra musical information is termed program music. So again, music that tells a story without lyrics, essentially. This term was first employed in the 19th century, at which point in history a fierce debate took place between various European composers and critics concerning the purpose of music. Some argued in favor of program music, even going so far as to say that music could and should convey complex philosophical ideas. Wagner belonged to this school of thought. Others advocated on behalf of absolute music, or music for music's sake. That is, music that does not aspire to be more than sound, and that should be judged on the basis of its form and construction, not its power to communicate. Even in the 19th century, however, program music was not a new thing. As we shall see, earlier European composers had already established the various techniques with which music can communicate meaning. Similarly, composers and performers in other parts of the globe had long exploited sound as a storytelling vehicle. Next, we will begin, however, in 19th century Europe, with perhaps the most famous piece of program music to emerge from the new concert tradition. So the piece that we're talking about is Symphonie Fantastique, also known as the Fantastical Symphony by Hector Berlioz. When the French composer Hector Berlioz premiered what was to be his most famous and influential work, he was only 27 years old. In 1830, however, was a big year for the young composer. Not only was his fantastical symphony, which in French is Symphonie Fantastique, premiered in December at the Paris Conservatory, but he also won the Rome Prize, the Prix de Rome, the top honor for French composers. However, Berlioz's training as a composer had been largely self-directed. His father had intended for him to become a physician, and it was to study medicine at the University of Paris that he had first moved to the city. Berlioz completed medical school, despite his disgust at the task of dissecting dead bodies, but he continued to pursue his musical interests through the course of his professional education. He gave up medicine upon graduating in 1824 and enrolled in the Paris Conservatory 2 years later. This is one of the best music schools within Europe at the time, and still very, very strong. So Berlioz belongs to the Romantic era of composers and music, so let's read about this. During the Romantic era, roughly 1815 to 1900, audiences were fascinated by the personal lives of artists. They tended to understand artistic expression as autobiographical, and they perceived works through the lens of an artist's personal experience. In the case of Fantastical Symphony, this was easy to do, for Berlioz was directly inspired by his own real-world experiences. Before discussing the symphony, therefore, we must dedicate some attention to Berlioz's love life. So, ask yourself, is this that different from modern times? We really do care, usually, about what are our artists' personal lives. It tells more drama to the story. The first example that comes to my mind is Taylor Swift, whose albums often have to do with her own romantic love life and breakups and all of those topics, right? We like to know about our artists' lives, and we view the music as a lens into their own personal experience. It's just like what we're seeing here in the Romantic era, and this was a fascinating thing for audiences at the time to get a glimpse into the artist's personal lives and emotions and feelings. So let's learn about Berlioz and his love life. In 1827, Berlioz attended a series of Shakespearean performances put on in Paris by a company of Irish actors. Over the course of several plays, he became obsessed with the actress Harriet Smithson, whom he saw in the roles of Ophelia in Hamlet and Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. His subsequent behavior, which included moving into an apartment from which he could monitor her own dwelling and subjecting her to a deluge of correspondence, can only be described as stalking. She ignored his advances, however, and returned to London in 1829 without ever having met the composer. So he had a huge, obviously, crush on her that maybe bordered on a little bit of stalking, as we can see. Despite never so much as speaking to Harriet, Berlioz felt compelled to channel his passion into musical composition. He let it be widely known that Fantastical Symphony, which tells the story of a romantic obsession gone wrong, we'll talk about the details later, was about Harriet Smithson. And this is a painting here of Harriet Smithson at the time. Berlioz's romantic interests were intense but fleeting. He soon recovered from his infatuation with Smithson and in 1830 became engaged to Marie Moke instead. His status as the winner of the Rome Prize required that he spend several years studying composition in Italy, and while he was abroad, he received word from Marie's mother that she was going to marry the wealthy piano manufacturer Camille Pleyel instead. Berlioz flew into a rage. He purchased guns, poison, and a costume, and boarded a train for Paris with the intention of sneaking into the Moke home dressed as a woman and murdering mother, daughter, and fiancé before taking his own life. During the course of the trip, however, his passion cooled, and he abandoned the plan before arriving in Paris. He returned to Italy to complete the terms of his award. So clearly he was very enthusiastic about his love life. Let's continue here. Then, in 1832, Harriet Smithson found herself back in Paris. Berlioz saw that she was provided with a ticket to the premiere of his second symphony, entitled The Return to Life. So again, the first symphony uh, is Symphonie Fantastique, the second is Return to Life. This was conceived of as a sequel to Fantastical Symphony. She wrote him a letter complimenting the symphony, and the two finally met. They began an affair and married in 1833, although it is widely suspected that Smithson only agreed to the union because of her dire financial situation. The two were not happy and formally separated in 1843. Here we see again Smithson and Hector Berlioz. So how does this relate to Berlioz's symphony? Let's talk about it. In the case of another composer, the above personal details might be gratuitous. In the case of Berlioz, however, they are essential. Not only did his audience know about his love life, but they relished the opportunity to perceive his music as a window into his most intimate passions. Of course, Fantastical Symphony was not altogether autobiographical. In fact, most of the story, to which we will now turn, was lifted from books that Berlioz was reading at the time. Berlioz went to great trouble to create, revise, and publicize the story told by his music. He published several versions, the last of which accompanied the 1855 version of the score. The score is just the complete Britten musical work. So with it, he includes some published material that tells the story to the audience as well. It was important to Berlioz that audiences were familiar with the story. For the 1830 premiere, he saw that his narrative was published in Parisian newspapers and distributed to audience members at the performance. At this time, it was unusual for concert patrons to be provided with a printed program. In the 1845 version of the score, Berlioz explained the importance of his narrative. He wrote, "The following program must therefore be considered as the spoken text of an opera, which serves to introduce musical movements and to motivate their character and expression." In short, he did not seem to believe that the music could speak entirely for itself. Berlioz subtitled his Fantastical Symphony "An Episode in the Life of an Artist" in 5 parts. The artist in question was, of course, himself. The 5 parts were 5 distinct movements, an unusual design for a symphony. While most symphonies have 4 movements, Berlioz was self-consciously following in the footsteps of Ludwig van Beethoven, whose only programmed symphony, his Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral Symphony, also had 5 movements. Beethoven's symphony told the story of a visit to the countryside, but it did so in very vague terms. The only text were the 5 movement titles, which described the sensation of peace upon arriving in nature: a scene by a brook, a peasant festival, a thunderstorm, and feelings of relief after the storm had passed. So that is Beethoven's 6th Symphony. To tell his story, Beethoven deployed musical topics associated with the countryside and incorporated mimetic gestures, including orchestral imitations of droning bagpipes and violent lightning strikes. Berlioz used the same techniques, but took the idea of writing a programmed symphony much further. So just to put this in perspective, Beethoven, who we see here, is usually considered to be early Romantic period. So he is one of the first people who starts to push these boundaries about how music can tell a story in the early part of the 18th century, sorry, the 19th century. Hector Berlioz is a little bit later, more mid to late Romantic period. So he's kind of building in the footsteps of Beethoven, we can say. And clearly he was inspired by him. So the Symphonie Fantastique is in 5 musical movements. These are sections of the piece. Berlioz movements are titled Reveries, Passions, 2. A ball. 3. Scene in the fields. 4. March to the scaffold. And 5. Dream of a witch's Sabbath. In the first movement, a young musician catches sight of his ideal woman and immediately falls in love with her. That sounds familiar, right? We just learned about that with his own personal life. We learn from Berlioz's text that the musician always hears the same melody in his head when he sees or thinks of her, a melody in which he recognizes a certain quality of passion, but endowed with the nobility and shyness which he credits to the objects of his love. Berlioz termed this melody the obsession, which in French is the idea fixe. So this is essentially to say the first movement, remember, it's about the life of an artist is what this whole symphony is about. And in this case, the artist is hearing this melody in his head whenever he thinks of his love interest. The obsession melody returns in each of the 5 movements. In the second movement, we hear it when the protagonist glimpses the object of his affection at a ball. In the third movement, the protagonist sits alone in the countryside, listening to shepherds play their pipes. At first, he feels hopeful about the future, but he is soon overwhelmed with suspicion and foreboding. The obsession melody reveals the subject of his disturbed brooding. Because we will examine the fourth and fifth movement in detail, it is worth reading Berlioz's original description of each in full. His text to accompany the fourth movement reads as follows. The fourth movement is called March to the Scaffold. We can see here some imagery. Here's what he wrote. Convinced that his love is spurned, the artist poisons himself with opium. The dose of narcotic, while too weak to cause his death, plunges him into a deep, heavy sleep, accompanied by the strangest of visions. He dreams that he has killed his beloved, that he is condemned, led to the scaffold, and is witnessing his own execution. The procession advances to the sound of a march that is sometimes somber and wild, and sometimes brilliant and solemn, in which a dull sound of heavy footsteps follows without transition the loudest outbursts. At the end of the march, the first 4 bars of the idea fixe reappear like a final thought of love, interrupted by the fatal blow. It is here that we begin to depart notably from reality. Not only did Berlioz never personally have this experience, but it is known with reasonable certainty that he never took drugs of any variety. Instead, he got the idea for this movement from a book he was reading, Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Continuing with movement 4, March to the Scaffold exhibits all 3 of the communication techniques outlined above: mimesis, quotation, and the use of musical topics. For most of the movement, we hear 2 contrasting march themes. One, according to Berlioz's description, is somber and wild, and the other, brilliant and solemn. These themes exemplify the use of musical topics. We are able to recognize them immediately as marches due to the tempo, the brisk character, and the instrumentation, which features percussion and brass. In the final passage of the movement, the tempo accelerates and the excitement builds. Then, out of nowhere, we hear the obsession melody played on a solo clarinet. This, of course, is an example of quotation. We are familiar with this melody, and we know that it represents the protagonist's beloved. We can easily hear it, therefore, as his final thought of her. Before the melody can conclude, a great noise from the orchestra represents the guillotine blade crashing down. This is followed by 2 pizzicato bounces on the severed head, and a series of raucous cheers from the crowd. All of this is mimesis, for Berlioz uses the orchestra to represent the sounds of the scene he is portraying. March to the Scaffold was the most successful of the symphony's 5 movements, and it was frequently programmed as a standalone work during Berlioz's lifetime. So here, just to talk about some of these terms, Pizzicato is the sound of plucking the sound of a violin or a cello string. This would give the sound of a bouncing, severed head in this case. Not the most pretty picture. We also hear a series of raucous cheers from the crowd. This is actually accomplished by different instruments in the orchestra, almost as if different voices from the crowd are really coming out of the texture of that scene. Now, I'm going to not play this just so that you can listen to it on your own with better sound quality. But again, I would suggest to listen to this video right here, which is a performance of Movement 4 of Symphonie Fantastique. It is the March to the Scaffold that we just covered. This does a really good job of breaking down the different sections. So I would, again, pause my video and watch this one in your own lecture slide right now, please. Okay, we've just talked about movement 4 of Symphonie Fantastique. Let's talk about movement number 5. Sorry, this is a typo. This should say Dream of a Witch's Sabbath. Excuse me, I'll fix that later. However, in the fifth and final movement, Dream of a Witch's Sabbath offers even better examples of our three communication strategies. It also shows off Berlioz's extraordinary skill at using the orchestra. The music of Berlioz is still studied today by students of orchestration, and his 1843 treatise on instrumentation is still in print. He was also responsible for growing the orchestra in size. Although he wanted 220 musicians for the premiere of Fantastical Symphony, he had to settle for a mere 130. In addition to increasing the size of the string sections, Berlioz increased the number of required wind parts. Fantastical Symphony calls for 4 different types of clarinets, 4 bassoons, 4 harps, and an enormous percussion section. In addition, 2 instruments, the ophicleide, part of the tuba family, and the cornet à pistons, part of the trumpet family, that were not typically included in the orchestra, are also included here. Berlioz explained the action in Dream of a Witch's Sabbath as follows. He says, "He sees himself at a witch's sabbath, in the midst of a hideous gathering of shades, sorcerers, and monsters of every kind, who have come together for his funeral. Strange sounds, groans, outbursts of laughter, distant shouts which seem to be answered by more shouts. The beloved melody appears once more, but has now lost its noble and shy character. It is now no more than a vulgar dance tune, trivial and grotesque. It is she who is coming to the Sabbath. Roar of delight at her arrival, she joins the diabolical orgy. The funeral knell tolls. Burlesque parody of the Dies Irae, the dance of the witches. The dance of the witches combined with the Dies Irae. Now this movement opens exactly as Berlioz describes, with strange sounds, groans, and outbursts of laughter. Strange sounds are certainly heard in the violins. The players employ a technique known as a tremolo, in which the bow is moved back and forth very, very quickly to produce a shaking effect. The cellos undeniably provide the groans, with their quick upward melodic sweeps. Both the violins and trombones can later be heard as laughing. Next, we hear distant shouts in the high winds echoed by more shouts from a muted horn, so different instruments contributing to this texture, making these shouts sound different. The opening passage, therefore, is constructed almost exclusively with the use of mimetic techniques, again back to the idea of mimesis, like mimicry. When the obsession melody returns, it has indeed transformed in character. It is now a lively, impish dance tune played on the E-flat clarinet, an uncommon, high-pitched version of the instrument with a piercing sound quality. The tune is at first interrupted by a mimetic roar of delight from the orchestra, after which it is heard in full. In this case, quotation is combined with the use of musical topic. We recognize the melody and understand what it represents, but the fact that it is presented as a dance tune adds meaning to its appearance. So again here, the fact that we hear again the idea fixe, it comes back again but at the same time, it has changed and adopted a new meaning of being a dance song now, so it has dance-like qualities to it. After the dance dies away, we hear the funeral bells. This barely even counts as mimesis, since Berlioz calls for actual bells to be struck. He uses the tubular orchestra bells that are included in the standard large percussion section. Next, he employs a second quotation. This time, he quotes a melody from outside the symphony. Indeed, it is a melody that was composed more than 500 years before Berlioz was born. The Dies Irae comes from the body of medieval Catholic church music known as Gregorian chant. This particular chant was composed in the 13th century as one is associated with the funeral mass or requiem. It was sung at the graveside and contains a particularly ominous text. The first three lines read as follows. A day of wrath that day. It will dissolve the world into glowing ashes, as attested by David together with the Sibyl. What troubling will there be, when the judge shall come to examine everything in strict justice. The trumpet's wondrous call, sounding abroad in tombs throughout the world, shall drive everybody forward to the throne. The long text continues on to describe the coming of Judgment Day, when sinners are cast into hell to endure eternal torment. Berlioz's audience in Catholic France would have recognized this melody immediately, and would likewise have known the associated text. For them, the Dies Irae carried connotations of terror and hellishness. By using it in his symphony, therefore, Berlioz was able to take advantage of those connotations without incorporating text directly. The Dies Irae melody provided the perfect backdrop for his triumphant witches. So this is a pretty interesting piece of music here, the Dies Irae. I would encourage you to take a look at this. Just search it up in YouTube and you will find it. Next, Berlioz incorporates another dance topic, in his synopsis at the Dance of the Witches. We don't recognize the melody itself, but we have no trouble acknowledging that it is a dance. And Berlioz's description helps us to understand exactly what is going on. Finally, before the raucous conclusion, we hear the Dies Irae and the Dance of the Witches juxtaposed, each sounding at the same time in a different part of the orchestra. The concluding passage also includes more unusual string techniques, including col legno, which means with the wood of the violin bow, for which players turn their bows over and bounce the stick on their strings. This creates an eerie trapping effect. And with all that backstory now, this is the slide that contains the video for movement number 5, Dream of a Witch's Sabbath, which is the conclusion of Symphonie Fantastique. I would encourage you to pause my video and to watch this YouTube video here that is on lecture slide number 24. Follow along with all of these great descriptors. It is good practice to see how the book goes about describing these pieces so that you can do the same for your project coming up as well. Again, pause the video and check out this one. Okay, we're coming up on a slight shift here, moving away from Berlioz and moving into the music of Modest Mussorgsky. He has a very famous set of pieces that are called Pictures at an Exhibition. This is him in a painting right here, the composer Mussorgsky. The Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky was just a generation younger than Berlioz, and their careers overlapped for several decades. The two composers, however, lived in different worlds. Berlioz was French and worked in Paris, a major European cultural center. He received a formal music education and was well connected with leading figures across the arts. Mussorgsky, on the other hand, was not even a professional composer, and was excluded from his country's growing musical establishment. His status as an outsider, however, only inspired Mussorgsky to find a unique artistic voice. and he emerged as one of the most important Russian composers of the 19th century. Modest Mussorgsky and Russian identity. Mussorgsky's career was split between military and civil service. He enrolled in cadet school at the age of 13 and subsequently accepted a commission in the Russian Imperial Guard. He resigned his commission in 1858 so as to be able to focus more energy on music, but it was not feasible for him to compose for a living, so he instead took a series of administrative posts within the government. Mussorgsky's main interest, however, was music. He studied composition with Mily Alexeyevich Balakirev, who had emerged as the ideological leader of the nationalist movement in Russian music. Mussorgsky also developed a close personal relationship with the other young composers in Balakirev's circle, all of whom saw themselves as anti-establishment figures in search of authentic Russian musical expression. Together, these composers were known as the Mighty Handful, an evocative nickname that has been identified with the progressive strain of late 19th century Russian music ever since. Despite their interest in developing a uniquely Russian school of composition, Mussorgsky and his colleagues were primarily influenced by European concert music. They studied the scores of Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, and Berlioz, the last of whom they particularly admired. Because they were largely self-trained and valued experimental approaches, however, these composers succeeded in adapting European forms and techniques to their own creative ends. So there is a very distinctly Russian sound at this time that shows what they were going for and the creativity that they discovered in their exploration of classical music. Now, as we saw in Berlioz, he was really using his own writing to influence how his piece was perceived. He was using that to tell the story through his symphony, not just the music, but the text that he has the audience read before the performance. With Mussorgsky, we're going to see a slightly different approach, which is capturing visual art in music. How can you take a picture for a painting, for example, and turn that into a full piece of music? Mussorgsky composed his piece Pictures at an Exhibition after attending an art exhibit in commemoration of his friend Victor Hartmann, who had died suddenly of an aneurysm in 1873. Hartmann had belonged to the progressive school of Russian art, which sought to develop a uniquely Russian approach to the visual arts. It is natural enough, therefore, that Mussorgsky should have felt a kinship with Hartmann, for he and the Mighty Handful sought to accomplish the same thing in the realm of music. Mussorgsky had acquired a large number of Hartmann's paintings, which he allowed to be displayed as part of the exhibit in St. Petersburg. After walking through the galleries, Mussorgsky had inspired to compose a piece of music that captured the experience in sound. He completed the work in only 20 days. Pictures at an Exhibition was initially conceived of as a 10-movement suite for piano. Each movement represents a Hartmann work, while a promenade interlude between many of the movements symbolizes the act of walking from one painting to the next. Unfortunately, many of the paintings themselves have been lost, but Hartmann's work has lived on in this enormously popular musical composition. So a couple things here. That last point, the fact that we've lost some of the paintings, but the music lives on. This is an interesting thing, that a painting is a physical object, so therefore it can dissolve, it can be lost. But a piece of music, once we have the original score, we can keep recreating that score and have these performances that prevail over time. So it is an interesting facet of music, as we saw with the previous chapter, that we can pass things down generation to generation. The other thing that's interesting about Pictures at an Exhibition in particular is this idea of the promenade, that by going between one picture to a next in a museum, you naturally have some time where you're just naturally walking and your mind maybe is moving away from what you just saw. So in Pictures at an Exhibition, we're going to hear the promenade interlude of music between each of the movements to act as almost a palate cleanser or a break from one painting moving into the next. It's a very interesting idea. Now, like we said, this piece was originally written for piano. Mussorgsky wrote for piano in part because he was not a skilled orchestrator. This means, how can you write for all of the instruments of the orchestra? However, a large number of later composers took on that task, and as a result, many different versions of Pictures at an Exhibition have been performed over the past century. Pictures is heard most frequently as an orchestral work, and the most successful orchestration was created by the French composer Maurice Ravel in 1922. There are also versions for chamber orchestra, band, brass ensemble, and solo guitar. However, the popularity of Pictures has resulted in additional adaptations that live outside the concert hall. It has been performed by numerous rock bands, including Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, who recorded it live in 1971, and even formed the basis for early experiments in the world of electronic music. For this reason, Pictures at an Exhibition presents a wonderful opportunity to consider the significance of timbre. We will examine two movements in depth, and for each we will compare four different versions: Mussorgsky's 1874 composition for piano, Ravel's 1922 orchestration, Japanese synthesizer artist Isao Tomita's 1975 interpretation, and German thrash metal band Mekon Delta's 1996 recording. All four versions contain exactly the same pitches and rhythms, but they sound quite different from one another due to the divergent sound qualities, the timbre, available from the piano, the orchestra, the synthesizer, and the rock band. It is impossible to argue that one version is the best. Instead, each brings unique strengths to the task of sounding Mussorgsky's composition, and each connects with different listeners. So again, this word timbre, the quality of the sound, we're going to tell immediately that each of these versions that we're going to listen to in the next couple slides is going to have a very unique sound quality to it, and they all tell the story with maybe just slightly different associations in timbre. The first movement of Pictures at an Exhibition is entitled The Gnome. Although the original Hartmann painting has been lost, it is known to have depicted a grotesque nutcracker with large teeth. It was undoubtedly disturbing. Mussorgsky captured the image and sound using a variety of techniques. The gnome begins with a sequence of abrupt, angular melodic fragments. They are unpredictable and unpleasing, lurching about in a way that mimetically captures the motion of the creature they portray. A second, contrasting section contains an uneven descending melody with a dissonant, oscillating accompaniment. A third section vacillates ominously between low and high pitches, while a final section is loud and threatening. Fragments of the first section interrupt when least expected. Throughout the gnome, it is characterized by contrast and surprise, and it concludes with a frightening rush to the final cadence. The listener never knows what is going to happen next and is not given the opportunity to relax. The piano version contains the unpredictable rhythms and rapid mood changes that are central to Mussorgsky's vision, but the instrument imposes several limitations. To begin with, striking the keys of a piano always produces essentially the same type of sound. While a piano can execute a large range of pitch and dynamic levels, its ability to do so does not compare to that of an orchestra, which can play higher, louder, lower, and softer. An orchestra, however, lacks the spontaneity and responsiveness of a solo pianist, who only has to coordinate with themselves. So there are some different differentiations here, right? The piano, when you're playing by yourself, just one person, you can change your speed or your tempo. You can be more expressive with how the music is flowing because it is just one person, although good orchestras can do that too. However, the orchestra has the advantage of a variety of different timbres from all the different instruments, as well as being able to play, like they said, higher, lower, louder, and softer. So there's much more contrasts available to us with the orchestra. Again, back to this term orchestration, we'll talk about Maurice Ravel's orchestration here. Ravel's orchestration has emerged as the most common because, like Berlioz, he knew how to take full advantage of the ensemble's potential. He puts the opening melodic gesture in the low strings with an echo in the low brass, thereby creating a darker and more ominous sound quality than is available from the piano. Punctuations from the percussion section further heighten the tension. The next passage features the warm sounds of flute and celeste, with an accompaniment by the string section using pizzicato, a technique for which players pluck the strings instead of bowing them, and glissando, a technique for which players slide their fingers down the length of the string. Just as Berlioz used the low brass to make his dies irae quotations sound threatening, Ravel uses them to increase the sense of danger and violence in his orchestration. Throughout, he never uses the same combination of instruments twice, thereby introducing an element of variety and surprise that was not available to Mussorgsky with just the piano version. So this is a very great and classic piece of music. I would encourage you to pause and check out this recording of the symphony orchestra version of the Gnome that was written by Mussorgsky, but then later orchestrated by Maurice Ravel. Check this out. This is the same piece. This is a great way to contrast the different timbres of just the orchestra, the whole orchestra, versus this version, which is the original of just solo piano. The same piece of music, but with a change in timbre due to the instrumentation. And again, this shows us the different forms and all the things that we can listen for in this version of the piece. Okay, again, we're taking lots of pauses here. These are two other versions of the piece to check out. Let's read about them here. Again, we're still on the Gnome, but these are all different renditions. In his synthesizer version, Tomita takes a similar approach, although of course he has a completely different set of sonic tools at his disposal. Like Ravel, Tomita explores a wide variety of sound qualities, some dark and muted, some percussive, some bright and zingy. He also applies modulatory techniques that transform those sounds, including low-frequency oscillation, glissandi, and panning. The end result is yet another gloomy sound world full of contrast and surprise. The next example, which is here, is Mekong Delta, who have a more limited sound palette with which to work, but it is well suited to the task. This is a rock band. They differentiate the sections of the piece primarily by changing the role of the drum set. In the first and second sections, the drummer mirrors the rhythm of the melody. In the third and fourth sections, however, the drummer sets up a steady rock beat, which lends the arrangement a sense of growing strength and determination. Other minor variations in instrumentation keep this version interesting throughout. So these are really fun to listen to, especially if you've already listened to the videos on the previous two slides. This version of the Gnome, which is all early electronic synthesizers, is extremely fun to listen to. And this one right here is the rock band Mekong Delta, their take on the same music, the Gnome. Again, the same notes, the same rhythms, but just instruments and changes in timbre. Check out those videos, please. Okay, we're continuing on. This is the next, or another movement of Pictures at an Exhibition, the fifth movement, in fact, called Ballet of the Unhatched Chicks. The fifth movement of Pictures at an Exhibition, Ballet of the Unhatched Chicks, is quite different. In this case, we still have the artwork that inspired the music. It is not a finished painting, but rather a sketch for a costume that Hartmann had designed for an 1871 production of the ballet Trilby at the Bolshoi Theatre. The cast members were to portray unhatched baby chickens dancing in their shells. And we can see these very absurd pictures here. They're, I think, meant to be slightly comical, of course. Mussorgsky clearly saw the humor in this image, as well as in the dancing that one might imagine to have been performed in such a costume. His brief musical depiction, therefore, is highly comical. He employs a simple ternary form, which is just ABA. That's a very good term to know. Although the A and B sections of the form feature different melodies, we hear the chicks chirping and hopping throughout. While Mussorgsky used dissonance to signal fear and danger in the gnome, here he uses it to indicate the ridiculous nature of the scene. Occasionally, a lone, sustained note interrupts the dance, the voice of the mother hen, perhaps? An abrupt ending completes the comic effect. And again, check this out here. These are three different versions of Ballet of the Unhatched Chicks from Pictures at an Exhibition. The first one here is the full orchestral arrangement, again, which was made by Maurice Ravel. The second version is the Japanese synthesizer artist Isao Tomita. This is a great version as well, and you can really hear how great the synthesizer is in this context. And the last one to check out, again, is the band Mekong Delta. They did this version as well. Check out all three of these videos. They're very short pieces, so I'd encourage you to check out all of them and enjoy them. Okay, we're moving right ahead here. Away from Mussorgsky, we're going further back in time to Antonio Vivaldi and his famous piece of music called The Four Seasons. Composers were writing program music long before Berlioz or Mussorgsky, who are both Romantic era composers. In earlier periods, however, such compositions were generally perceived as entertaining novelties, not the future of concert art. The Italian violinist and composer Antonio Vivaldi, who lived from 1678 to 1741, was particularly fond of program music, and he produced a great deal. His set of violin concertos, known as the Four Seasons, in Italian Le Quattro Stagioni, in 1725, are the most famous. Indeed, they rank among the best-known pieces of music from the European concert tradition. Now, Vivaldi is a really great figure to study in music history. He's part of the classical era of music, so he precedes all the composers that we've already learned about in this chapter by at least 150, if not 200 years. But we'll see that he was actually very ahead of his time. Even though he was writing in the classical era, he does kind of hint at some of the ideas that are kind of gonna be established later on in the Romantic era when it comes to program music. The life of Antonio Vivaldi. Vivaldi spent his life in the city of Venice, which at the time was a wealthy and independent republic. He initially trained as a Catholic priest, but ill health prevented him from performing many of his duties. However, he became highly skilled as a violinist and composer, and in 1703 he took the position of violin master at a local orphanage, the Devout Hospital of Mercy. Note here that the hospital at this time does not indicate a center for medical care, it was an orphanage. Venetian orphanages were not the squalid workhouses we know from Victorian literature. Indeed, quite the opposite. It was common, even acceptable, for Venetian aristocrats to keep mistresses, but the children of these relationships could not be brought up in the marital home. Instead, unwanted infants were deposited at orphanages via the scaffetta, which was an opening just large enough to fit a newborn. While not all of the surrendered infants were of high birth, the city's noblemen took an interest in the welfare of their illegitimate children, which meant that the orphanages were always well funded. The children were brought up with all of the advantages, except for parents, and were prepared for comfortable lives. This painting here shows the city of Venice around the time here when Vivaldi would have lived in the city. Again here, a closer look at the city of Venice, and also here a depiction that shows the orphanage where Vivaldi worked for many years of his life. The Devout Hospital of Mercy, at which Vivaldi took a position, was an orphanage for girls. Vivaldi's job was to teach them the musical skills that would allow them to secure desirable husbands. Vivaldi was exceptionally good at his job, and soon the girls at the orphanage became the best musicians in the city. He not only taught them how to play their instruments, but wrote music for them to play. His primary vehicle was the concerto, which is a work for an instrumental soloist accompanied by an orchestra. Over the course of his career, Vivaldi wrote 500 concertos. About half were for violin, including 37 for his most successful protege, a virtuoso known as Anna Maria dal Violin. The other were mostly for bassoon, flute, oboe, and cello, all instruments played by girls at the hospital. Again, the orphanage. Naturally enough, the citizens of Venice wanted to hear the girls perform. This, however, presented a serious problem. Women in Venetian society were generally prohibited from performing publicly. Some women took to the opera stage, but in doing so, they were confirming their sexual availability and precluding the possibilities of marriage. Most of the girls at the orphanage were destined for either husbands or a lifetime of service to the church, so they could not become soiled in this way. Those who did desire a career in music were likely to stay at the orphanage into adulthood, where they were provided with an opportunity to teach and perform. At least two girls who studied at the orphanage, Anna Bonn and Vincenta da Ponte, went on to become composers. Okay, continuing with Vivaldi. The orphanage developed a clear means by which to facilitate public performances without upsetting social convention. Each Sunday night, a public vespers service was held for which the orchestra and choir provided music. Although this weekly church service was, for all intents and purposes, a public concert, the simple act of retitling protected the girls' honor. Members of high society came from across the region to hear the girls, who were physically isolated from the visitors to further ensure their chastity. So as we can see here, the social conventions of the time did not allow for female performers unless it was in this context of a church setting. So even though people came to hear the music specifically, this was all related to the Catholic mass services of the time. Let's continue here. Vivaldi was promoted to music director in 1716, and he continued to teach at the orphanage as he became quite famous outside of Venice. In addition to writing instrumental music, he wrote operas that were staged across Europe and provided choral music for Catholic church services. His long tenure at the orphanage was noteworthy, for male teachers at girls' orphanages usually got into trouble with one of their charges and eventually had to be dismissed. Vivaldi, on the other hand, developed a reputation for his ethical behavior. So you can see here, this picture shows these public Vespers concerts. We see the audience members from the community who have gathered below, and then the girls are positioned way up high here, which is again one of the social conventions of the time, having to separate them from the audience who came to see them. For Vivaldi, the concerto was a relatively new genre. The first concerto had been written by Italian composers in the middle of the 17th century. At first, soloists were used primarily to add variation in volume to an orchestral performance. After all, a few players makes less noise than many, and individual string instruments of the time did not have a large dynamic range. Vivaldi still valued the potential for concertos to include a great deal of variety, but he also used them as a vehicle for virtuosic display. The solo parts, therefore, were often quite difficult and allowed the player to show off her capabilities. So we're getting into 18th century concerto form, this new genre of classical music. The concerto was really a chance for a soloist to be featured along with the orchestra. An early 18th century concerto always followed the same basic form. It would contain three movements in the order fast, slow, fast. So one thing to remember is that talking about Vivaldi and 18th century classical music, we are in the classical era, not the romantic era that we had been dealing with earlier in the chapter. So in the classical music, they are extremely focused and concerned about the form of a piece of music, that they having these structures meant that the audience kind of knew what to expect, even though the notes might be different, the melodies might be different. The order in these formal considerations kind of tie things together from artist to artist and establish the style that we now call classical music. So the order here is fast, slow, fast between the three movements of the concerto: a fast movement, a slow movement, and then ending with a fast movement. It's a nice form when you think about it. Starting off with high energy, relaxing a little bit with the tempo, maybe some softening the volume perhaps too, and then ending kind of on a big bang too. The outer movements, so the two fast ones, would be both in ritornello form. Ritornello is an Italian term that roughly translates to the little thing that returns, and it refers to a passage of music that is heard repeatedly. In a concerto, the ritornello is played by the orchestra. It is heard at the beginning and at the end of a movement, but also frequently throughout, although often not in its entirety. In between statements of the ritornello, the soloist plays. Although the ritornello always remains basically the same, the material played by the soloist can vary widely. The slow movement of a concerto would consist of an expressive melody in the solo instrument backed up by a repetitive accompaniment in the orchestra. So again, the orchestra is really playing this ritornello theme. It's just like we saw with strophic form a little bit, these things that keep coming back. It helps the song have that continuity. So this is a term to know, ritornello, the little thing that returns. It's a great Italian term again. Now we're going to get more into the four seasons. We will see an example of these forms in Vivaldi's Spring Concerto. Remember that there's one for each of the four seasons. However, form is certainly not what makes this composition interesting. Vivaldi published his Four Seasons concertos in a 1725 collection entitled The Contest Between Harmony and Invention. This evocative title was supposed to draw attention to novel aspects of Vivaldi's latest work. While 8 of the 12 concertos contained in the collection were adventurous in purely musical terms, the first 4 were unusual for programmatic reasons. So again, that idea of program music appearing even here in the classical era before it was truly an established term. Each of the 4 seasons concertos, one each for spring, summer, autumn, and winter, was accompanied by a sonnet. The poetry described the dramatic content of the music, and Vivaldi went to great trouble to indicate exactly how the music reflected the text. To do so, he inserted letter names beside each line of poetry and then placed the same corresponding letter at the appropriate place in the musical score. The correlation between musical and poetic passages, however, is easy to hear. This, in combination with the fact that no author is indicated, has led most scholars to believe that Vivaldi wrote the sonnets himself. So here we see that Vivaldi wrote poetry that he wanted to be mirroring with the music. So he puts these letter names into both copies, both the poetry and the musical score, so that the performers, or maybe just he would know, but that's how he created the work. It was really a reference to the energy in the descriptions that are present in the poetry, and then he later decided to set it to music. The sonnet for the Spring Concerto reads as follows. The lines of poetry are broken up between the 3 movements, each of which is titled with an Italian tempo marking. So in this time period, the movements we can see don't have specific names. They're just named after the tempo marking, or the instructions for the performer about how the music should feel and move, especially when it comes to tempo. So the first one here is allegro. In Italian, allegro literally just means going or moving. So it has some forward momentum to it. And here's the poetry that goes with the music. Springtime is upon us. The birds celebrate their return with festive song, and murmuring streams are softly caressed by the breezes. Thunderstorms, those heralds of spring, roar, casting their dark mantle over heaven. Then they die away to silence, and the birds take up their charming songs once more. So already when you hear this, you can tell it was written by a musician, someone who is really paying attention to the sounds that you hear during springtime. He mentions birds, murmuring streams, breezes, thunderstorms. What else here? Sorry, silence. Always to have some break from this noise too. And finally, the birds take up their charming songs once more. So we can already tell there is a story being told here. It sounds like a springtime day, thunderstorms, oftentimes in springtime too. And this, we can already tell, is going to be great material to turn into music. Here's the second movement. It is much shorter. Let's read it. It's largo. Largo is a slow moving tempo. The poetry reads, "On the flower-strewn meadow, with leafy branches rustling overhead, the goat-herd sleeps, his faithful dog beside him." So this, a much more maybe mellow scene here. We see goat herds. We've already heard in the previous slides that oftentimes this kind of goat herd or pastoral scenery, we think pastures, open green fields, are often accompanied by the sounds of bagpipes or things that are meant to mimic bagpipes because these are countryside instruments. Here's the final movement, movement 3, also allegro, so again, fast, slow, fast. It says, "Led by the festive sound of rustic bagpipes, nymphs and shepherds lightly dance beneath the brilliant canopy of spring." So here we see a much more festive scene. Spring is often associated with new life, rebirth. So we can see here the festive sound of rustic bagpipes, nymphs and shepherds, brilliant canopy of spring. So this is much more folk inspired, but Vivaldi does it in a very beautiful and clever way. We're going to break down each of the three movements now, not in terms of his poetry so much, although we will make that connection, but let's really try to find out what are we listening for. Movement 1, also of spring. The opening ritornello in the first movement captures the spirit of the first line of poetry. It is joyful and exuberant. It is also simple and repetitive, giving the impression that it might really be folk music, the kind of tune one might hear at a country dance. The birds appear with the first solo episode, which requires two violinists from the orchestra to join with the soloist in imitating avian, which means bird-like, calls. After an orchestra ritornello, again, it came back again, we hear some new music from the orchestra that captures the sounds of murmuring strings and caressing breezes. Another ritornello is followed by the thunderstorm. Rapid notes, sudden accents, and violent ascending scales in the orchestra are interrupted by energetic arpeggios in the solo violin, while this shifts to the minor mode and darkens the mood of the passage. So here we see this term arpeggios. This literally means broken chord in Italian. It's when you take the notes of a chord and play them just one at a time. So it sounds like we're kind of leaping up these notes, and usually they're played with, in this case, a lot of energy and excitement. Jumping around gives us a sense of not being able to follow the music quite as well, but a real sensory expression through all these range of notes. We see here too the ritornello always played by the orchestra. We heard it first, and then it came back again. Here we see again. After another ritornello, the bird songs gradually re-emerge, gaining strength as the thunderstorm clears for good. One more solo passage and a final ritornello closes out the movement. So this first movement kind of sets the mood of spring, but then quickly gets brushed away by this thunderstorm that kind of takes over, although the birds come in at the very end after the storm clears out. Now this is a chance to listen to the movement that we just discussed, Spring Movement 1. Again, really good timestamps here with the form, ritornello A, ritornello B, ritornello C, ritornello D. Excuse me here, let me move my cursor. Ritornello, then E, then ending with the ritornello, right? So then they give you some good chances to listen. Look at here, they have also the poetry with each of the timestamps too that relates to the movement. So you can actually see, does the music that we're hearing relate to what the poetry is telling us? So again, pause my video and please check out this YouTube clip here of Vivaldi's Movement 1 of Spring. Let's go on to the second and third movement quickly here. The second movement is considerably simpler. The solo violin plays a beautiful, calm melody, suitable for the portrayal of a sleeping goat herd. Underneath, the leafy branches wrestle in the violins, who play undulating, uneven rhythms throughout, while the faithful dog barks in the violas. This last touch is a little strange, for a barking dog would certainly wake the sleeper, but Vivaldi did not have any other tools with which to represent the animal. So they're saying here, suddenly you hear this barking dog kind of sound imitated by the viola, which is a slightly larger version of the violin. And even though that's kind of an odd way to depict it, how else would you represent a dog, right? The fact that no low strings or harpsichord are present in this movement gives it an ethereal feeling. So we kind of dropped out all the low-end sounding instruments, and we're only hearing the violin, the violas, okay? Again, that much higher texture, almost as if there's a mist on the ground or a moisture in the air due to the rainstorm that has just passed. Again, remember that this is a simpler set of music. It's much more tranquil. And also this represented the poetry that was the shortest passage too. So take a chance to listen to this one here. And now here's the last movement. The last movement has the same form as the first, although the storytelling is considerably less intricate. In the opening ritornello, Vivaldi imitates a bagpipe by having the violas, cellos, and basses sustain long notes outlining the interval of a fifth. That's like do, so, this fifth here. The sound is meant to remind the listener of a bagpipe's drone. So when you hear those two notes together, just like a bagpipe, we sustain those notes throughout the composition. It gives it a certain quality that we hear specifically with bagpipes. The rhythms of the melody are appropriate for dancing, while the lively mood sets the scene for a celebration of spring. The soloist, other than momentarily imitating a bagpipe herself, does not contribute anything in particular to the storytelling. She seems content to interject lively, virtuosic passage work in the appropriate points. So for me, this last movement really does sound like more of a festive scene. The poetry mentions the dancing of shepherds and nymphs after the rainstorm has passed. There's a new spring day. Sounds like they're celebrating, right? Again, spring, this kind of rebirth that we see happening. The soloist, for me, is just another player in the story, but they are clearly virtuosic. They're playing material that almost like having a really great fiddle player at your party might have been like. Again, I would encourage you to pause the video. Please watch these two YouTube links here, which show the other two movements of spring. Although I think on the next slide, I'm going to have a video of all three movements played by an exceptional group. So you might want to wait for that instead. Here we go. So these are all four movements of Vivaldi's Four Seasons. We see here number 1, which is spring, number 2, which is summer, number 3, autumn, and number 4, winter. Now this is an exceptional group of musicians that are actually playing very much in the Baroque-inspired style of Vivaldi. So when you watch this, just enjoy it. And I encourage you to watch this with the captions on, because what they did is they put as subtitles within each of these tracks the poetry of Vivaldi exactly as it would line up with the music. So again, this is a great group. I just love their energy. They really, I think, tell the story through their instruments in a way that you don't see with every orchestra. So check these guys out. They're amazing. Okay, so we've talked about early program music with Vivaldi. Now we're going to jump into Chinese solo repertoire. This, we will see is similar to program music, even though it existed in its own separate time frame. It kind of shows us how music is universal in storytelling. The things that we hear really have been pretty universal. We hear things, happy music sounds cheerful to us, and we've categorized and made these in societies across the world. So the two pieces that we'll look at are Attack on All Sides and Spring River in the Flower Moon Night. At the same time that European composers were producing a I'll read that again. At the same time that European composers were producing vivid, programmatic works, a parallel tradition of program music was flourishing in China. We will consider two examples from the literature for solo instruments, which is predominantly programmatic. One piece will portray a historical battle, while the other will reflect on the contents of a famous poem. Although Chinese music follows different rules than European music, it is not difficult for a Western listener to understand what this music is about. This is due both to the use of mimesis and to a cross-cultural agreement about the representation of calm and energetic moods through sound. We're going to talk again about the oral tradition. We saw this in the previous week's chapter talking about folk music in Appalachian America. When we discuss this music, however, we will have to do it in slightly different terms than we have so far. Although Chinese musicians have developed a variety of notational systems that have allowed musical compositions to be preserved, they have not always prioritized notation or valued the authority of the composer. Individual pieces are usually passed down directly from performer to performer by means of oral tradition, while the names of composers are seldom recorded. As a result, we are not always able to identify the authors of this repertoire or determine when the pieces were written. The history of music in China extends back for thousands of years, and some of the instruments date to antiquity. This is not to say, however, that the music has remained unchanged, or that all of the repertoire items are old. As we saw in Chapter 4, Beijing opera dates only to the 18th century, and alternative opera traditions have continued to emerge and change. In the sphere of instrumental music, the use of individual instruments as well as their physical structure transform with the passage of time. We will encounter two instruments, the pipa and the guqin. In doing so, we will consider their history, construction, and use in the performance of program music. The pipa, Attack on All Sides. So this is our first instrument that we'll look at, and also the first piece that we'll look at, called Attack on All Sides. The pipa is a type of lute used in a variety of Chinese musical traditions. It dates back to at least the 3rd century, although it did not acquire its modern form until the 20th century. So again, instruments evolve and change over time. Like most of the instruments commonly used in China, the pipa was probably imported from Central Asia or India along the Silk Road trade route. At first, it was used only to accompany singing and dancing, but during the Tang Dynasty, between 618 and 907, a repertoire of solo pipa music emerged. As such, the pipa repertoire is among the oldest in the Chinese tradition. The instrument was historically favored by both aristocrats and working musicians, and has long associated with women, specifically courtesans. So here we see an 897 painting portrays the planet Venus embodied as an elegant lady playing the pipa. Here's a picture of it right here to take a look. The pipa has a distinctive pear-shaped body and is played in an upright position. Modern instruments have 24 frets, spaced according to the Western chromatic scale. The frets on the neck have a unique wedge shape, such that a player's fingers do not in fact touch the neck when the string is depressed. The pipa's 4 strings can be tuned to a variety of pitches. Although they used to be silk, the fact that pipa strings have been manufactured out of steel since the 1950s gives the modern instrument a powerful sound. This is further accentuated by the fact that the players wear picks on the fingers of their right hands. So these are small, usually metal devices that you put onto your finger. It's almost like having an extra fingernail that loops onto your finger so that you can pluck the strings, kind of like having a guitar pick, but this way you can have one on all of your fingers of your right hand. A great deal of the traditional pipa repertoire has survived into the present day due to the publication of 4 collections in the 19th century. The notation used in these collections, known as gongche, is completely unrelated to Western staff notation. Instead of mapping pitches and rhythms onto a graph, as staff notation does, it represents pitches with numbers and rhythms, with dots and lines. In the context of a tradition that is primarily aural, however, such notation was used only to document music for preservation or reference. It was not used to learn unfamiliar music or in performance. So the music here is not something that you would read on a stage when you were performing. It's not even used for learning the music. We learn in this tradition by listening, by hearing another person play the piece. You would learn it just through the process of listening and trying to play it yourself. We call that the aural process of learning. The music was written down, as we've just learned about this kind of gongche type of musical notation, but it was used just to preserve the music so that it would not be lost and could be passed down through times. Here we see a great picture, perfect, of the gongche notation from the 1864 collection. So again, this would be their version in this tradition of musical notation. Now, Attack on All Sides is the most popular piece in the pipa repertoire. It is also very difficult. However, it is usually only performed by the most accomplished players. The earliest notated version appears in an 1818 collection, but it is impossible to say when, or by whom, it was in fact composed by. Attack on All Sides is an example of a large composition, containing many distinct sections. The pipa repertoire also includes small compositions, which are shorter and have a single section. So this is a large composition with many different sections. While Attack on All Sides can always be recognized and identified, some published versions omit sections that are included elsewhere. Therefore, not every performance is identical. No single version can be identified as correct. This can be contrasted with most music in the European concert tradition, for which there is generally understood to exist a single, authoritative version. As with Beijing opera, pipa solos are often divided into civil and martial, the latter having to do with military themes. So again, just like Beijing opera, the civil works or pieces of music and the martial works. Civil ones we can imagine are going to be more maybe calm. They deal with the lives of everyday people, love interests, things like that, everyday events. The martial category is really this category of representing famous battle scenes or accompanying fighting on stage in the case of Beijing opera. Now, Attack on All Sides is just a musical composition. It doesn't go with any opera, but it still fits into this martial category. Attack on All Sides is most certainly a martial composition. It portrays a famous battle that took place in 202 BC between the armies of the two Chinese provinces, Western Shu and Han, who were fighting for dominion over China. The conflict ended with the Battle of Gaixia, in which the Han troops kidnapped the Shu general's wife and used her to lure the enemy troops into a canyon. There, they fell victim to the ambush from 10 sides, which is another common title for this piece. The battle itself hinged on musical warfare, for the Han sought to defeat their enemy by psychological means. To this end, they sang Chu folk songs throughout the night, with the effect of making the demoralized enemy homesick and inspiring soldiers to desert. So what they're saying is that they were singing folk songs of their enemy to make them want to return home and to basically stop fighting. The Chu general, Sheng Yu, is said to have composed a song of his own that same night. So this is the victim of the losing army's general. His lament, the Song of Gaixia, is still performed today. Tradition holds that he first sang the verses in alternation with his wife, who, feeling that she was at fault for the defeat, subsequently killed herself with his sword. The battle ended with Zhang Yu's suicide on the banks of the Wu River. All of this is captured in Attack on All Sides. The fact that this composition is made up of many sections allows the performer to explore the various emotions and activities of the battle scene. In the first sections, we hear witness to the assembling Han troops. The energy of the music communicates therefore vitality and resolution, but we also hear imitations of the drums and bugles of battle. The battle itself is captured by a variety of virtuosic pipa techniques that produce rapid sequences of notes. After the battle, however, the music becomes mournful, a reflection of Zhang Yu's sorrow at his loss. The final word goes to the victor, however, and the piece concludes with a representation of the Han general's triumph. So here you can see the video shows the pipa. Remember that all the things that we've just discussed, the drums and bugles, the battle cries, the sorrowful song, and the victorious triumph at the end is all going to be played on a single instrument, and it shows just how versatile the music and the imagery that we hear from the music is in telling the story. Again, you might have to know this story to understand the music in this sense, but once you know this history, which most Chinese people would, this music really resonates. So now that you know a little bit about the history, I encourage you to pause the video, watch this YouTube link with a solo pipa performance of Attack on All Sides. We're going to move on to the next piece here, which is going to feature a different instrument, a different piece of music with a different origin story. The instrument that we're talking about is the guzheng, and the composer is Peng Shuwen. We're going to talk about a piece of music called Spring River in the Flower Moon. The oldest extant guzheng dates to about 500 BC. The guzheng is a type of zither, and its plucked strings run along the face of a resonant wood box. Each string passes over an individual wooden bridge, which can be moved to adjust the pitch. Players use picks on the fingers of the right hand to pluck the strings to one side of the bridges, while using the left hand either to pluck strings on the right hand side or to press or pull the strings on the other side. This pushing and pulling causes pitch fluctuations, which are carefully controlled and used to ornament the melody. So we can see here the construction of the instrument. These are the movable bridges that are made of wood, and just by shifting their position on the string, you can kind of retune the instrument to really any kind of tuning that you might desire. What they said is correct. You can see here the picks on the hand used to pluck the strings on the right side. The left hand can do multiple roles. It can either pluck as well on the right side, or it can be used to bend the pitch of the note by pressing down and basically increasing the pressure on the string to raise the pitch of the note, raise or lower. As with the pipa, the strings of the guzheng, once silk, have been made of steel since the 1950s. They increased in number from 13 to 21 around the same time. The strings are tuned to the pitches of the pentatonic scale, which is common in Chinese music. We might think of these as the first, second, third, fifth, and sixth notes of the major scale. So just to hear what that sounds like, it would be like singing do, re, mi, sol, la, do, la, so, mi, re, do. These are the pitches of the pentatonic scale, which just means, quite literally, 5 tones, penta and tone. Because the modern guzheng is so different from the ancient instrument, performers tend to favor recently composed pieces that make use of its full range. So remember, that the instrument has increased in size with the number of strings, so therefore people prefer to play pieces that are more recently composed because it makes use of the newly established abilities of the instrument. Such is the case with our example, Spring River in the Flower Moon Night, which is the work of Peng Shuwen, who lived from 1931 to 1996. Following the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Peng became a leading figure in the development of post-revolution Chinese music. In particular, he contributed to the development of the Chinese orchestra, an ensemble type that dates only to the 1930s. In most traditional forms of Chinese ensemble music, only one of each instrument is included, and the performers are granted the freedom to embellish their individual parts. In a Chinese orchestra, on the other hand, instruments of the same type are gathered into sections, and they use notated music to play in unison under the leadership of a conductor. This approach is obviously modeled on the European orchestra, and its popularity at first reflected Chinese admiration for Western technological achievements. Peng became director of the China Broadcasting Chinese Orchestra, one of the most important ensembles of its type, in 1956, when he was only 24 years old. In addition to improving the tuning and balance of the orchestra, he arranged a large number of pieces from the European repertoire for Chinese orchestra, and composed original pieces. One of these was Spring River in the Flower Moon Night, which has soon become even more popular with solo guzheng players. As we will see, its pentatonic pitch content and meditative mood suit the instrument of the guzheng well. The title, Spring River in the Flower Moon Night, refers to a famous poem written by Zhang Ruxu around the turn of the 8th century. The poem has inspired countless artistic interpretations over the centuries, including paintings and musical compositions. As the title might suggest, Zhang's poem describes the moonlit Yangtze River. After several evocative passages that conjure the beauty of the scene, however, he turns to themes of longing and loss, meditating on the ephemerality of life and the sorrows of travelers who leave their loved ones behind. So that gives us a reference for this poem, which we can see here was actually quite old, but was made into a piece of music later on. In fact, it says here, including paintings and musical compositions. So this has been made into many paintings, several other musical compositions over the years, but we'll see that Peng Shuwen, the composer that we're talking of, he made his own rendition of this same poem. In his composition, Peng strives to evoke the full range of emotions contained in the poem. The guzheng version of the Spring River in the Flower Moon Night requires a variety of techniques, including rapid tremolo picking on a single string, strums, both delicate and energetic, left-hand bends that add notes to the melody, and left-hand bends that are merely ornamental. Peng's ultimate goal is to leave the listener in the same state of sorrowful tranquility that they would experience upon reading the poem. So, similar to Vivaldi, he is inspired by the poetry, and he wants his music to evoke the same feelings that the poetry would leave on the reader through his music. Here is a great video that they were also doing some Chinese brush painting alongside. So we see here the music, which is inspired by the poetry, which is also inspiring some live painting as well. So check out this video here of Spring River in the Flower Moon Night featuring the guzheng. Our next selection is a modern day program music by composer Catherine Likuta, her piece called Lesions. Although program music in the European tradition flourished most notably in the 19th century, many composers still conceive of their music in narrative terms. Composers continue to be inspired by stories and images from the physical world, and they continue to communicate those stories through sound. One such composer is Catherine Likuta, born in 1981, who exclusively writes program music. We will examine a recent composition of hers that tells a deeply personal story. that of her mother's struggle with the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Here we can see the composer, Catherine Lakuta, born in Ukraine, but now lives in Australia. Let's learn about the inspiration for her piece, Lesions. Like Berlioz, Lakuta chose to provide the listener with a description of her music. We will therefore allow her to explain its contents and purpose in her own words. She writes, Lesions was commissioned by Paul Dean for Ensemble Q and was written for Paul Dean, Trish O'Brien, and Peter Luff. So this is becoming more and more common in the classical music tradition, that people will know who specifically they're writing for the premiere of their piece, which might influence how they choose to write for those instruments and which instruments they write for. The term lesions refers to regions in organs and tissue which have suffered damage through injury or disease, such as a wound, ulcer, abscess, or tumor. I first heard this term in 2004 when my mother, age 42 at the time, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of multiple sclerosis. While she had suffered from many disturbing, unexplainable, and painful symptoms for 16 years prior to that, the diagnosis of MS did not bring us any relief or closure. Virtually every family has a loved one who is suffering or suffered from an incurable illness. While this is a very heavy subject, I believe it is definitely worth talking about for two simple reasons. One, to show those who are affected that they are not alone and that there are millions of people in the world who are going through similar struggles. To remind those lucky few who have not been affected that we have to keep looking for cures every day. So again, this would be the explanation that the audience is given before listening to her piece. It helps you understand these deep emotional themes that she is trying to strike with her music, and also these two reasons potentially for why did she choose to write music about such an incredibly heavy subject matter. Lesions is written in 4 parts that represent the 4 most common stages of dealing with incurable illness. These are sadness, anxiety, denial, and finally, acceptance. The absence of a pause between the last 2 movements has an extra musical meaning. Though denial and acceptance are antithetical states of mind, many patients find themselves stuck between these two for a long time, sometimes for the rest of their lives. The new reality is too difficult to accept, yet the symptoms are just as difficult to deny. So what they're saying is that the final 2 movements, denial and acceptance, are not going to have any kind of musical pause in between them, like we saw between sadness and anxiety and denial. These two are going to flow straight into each other, which resonates with these themes that we just read, this fact that these feelings often fluctuate between people who have had family members in this situation. Lesions is written for 3 instruments, French horn, clarinet, and cello. As Lakuta explains, Lesions is more than just a piece of music. It also fulfills both therapeutic and advocacy roles. Writing this piece provided relief for Lakuta, as she was able to translate her difficult experience into expressive sound. At the same time, she hopes that it will bring comfort to others in a similar situation. Lesions, however, is not meant only to provide solace. Lakuta hopes that it will also inspire action on the behalf of those who suffer from currently incurable illnesses. It might seem odd that such a personal creation should result from a commission. A commission is the process by which a performer, producer, or organization hires a composer to create a new musical work. When a work is commissioned, the composer is often provided with specific guidelines concerning instrumentation, length, and level of difficulty. Sometimes these requirements impede creativity, but the best composers have always been able to suit their style and ambitions to the performers and situation at hand. In this case, the commissioning musicians were long-time collaborators of Lakuta's, and they were able to work together to bring her vision to life. Lakuta has told us which emotions her music expresses, but she does not provide any details about how she captures feelings and sound. She presumes correctly that most listeners will easily perceive and understand the emotional states. Here, however, we will explicitly consider how these abstract emotions can be represented in musical terms. The first section, sadness, is characterized by a repeated motif in the clarinet and cello. So the same musical idea repeated several times. Over the top of this, the horn enters with a mournful melody. At first, the music is calm and stately. The melody, however, becomes increasingly agitated as it is passed from the horn to the clarinet. The volume increases and the rhythm loses its stability, until eventually we hear cries of anguish from the clarinet. When the opening motif returns, it is with a sense of resignation. The second section, Anxiety, opens with a related motif, but the tempo is faster and the rhythm more agitated. This section is characterized by frequent change, as if the protagonist cannot get settled into place. Background motifs continually emerge, only to disintegrate and transform. There is no sense of key or tonal center. Instead, the pitches float uncomfortably in space. So again, tied to anxiety. Denial, the third section, opens with a series of dissonant chords, after which an aggressive motif in the cello establishes a frenetic tempo. The energy continues to build, and the music is frequently interrupted by pauses and rhythmic shifts. When the motif from the opening of the piece returns, marking the beginning of the acceptance section, it has also been transformed. It is now loud, strong, and insistent. This statement is followed by a new, waltz-like melody in the clarinet that returns us to the opening motif, now restored to its original character. Following the emotional journey of the piece, however, the motif means something new. It communicates sadness, yes, but the self-conscious sadness of one who has come to terms with loss. And there's no YouTube link for this one, but you can go to the artist's SoundCloud page right here, and I would encourage you to listen to her piece, Lesions. Now, with talking about Catherine Lakuta and her piece, Lesions, it's important to talk about the idea of permanency. This is the first textbook ever to include the music of Lakuta, and it may be the last. She is still near the beginning of her career, and although she has been very successful, it is difficult to predict which composers or works will enter the permanent concert repertoire and which will not. There is no doubt that Lesions is an excellent piece of music that deserves to be heard for a long time. However, countless such pieces have flashed into existence over the centuries, only to disappear when they fail to attract the attention of an influential performer or publisher. Permanency is largely a matter of chance. This visit with Lakuta, therefore, is a valuable reminder that for every famous composer or work of the past, there are thousands of wonderful compositions and creators waiting rediscovery. So again, which composers get to be in the textbooks is essentially what they're saying. People like Mozart have survived for hundreds of years, but in 300 or 400 years, are people going to still know about Catherine Lakuta's work, right? It's largely a matter of chance. There are many people who were writing music at the same time of Mozart who we don't know very much about, or who haven't remained popular in the concert tradition. We're going to conclude this chapter with a consideration of how cultural context can facilitate musical storytelling even in the absence of a specific text. So we're going to take a look at Anushka Shankar and her family, the Shankar family, Ravi Shankar as well, and some Indian classical music, more specifically Raga Madhuvanti, and storytelling through Indian classical music. Every example that we have considered thus far has been accompanied at some level by a description. In the case of Berlioz, we had a long prose explanation from the composer himself. In the case of Mussorgsky, references to the titles of paintings. In the case of Vivaldi, a poem. The titles of the two Chinese examples refer to a historical event on the one hand and a poem on the other. Lakuta explains how her composition connects with lived experience. This final example also has specific meaning, but it is only available to those initiated into the musical tradition from which it comes. While anyone can enjoy the sounds of Raga Madhuvanti, its meaning is unveiled only when one positions it correctly within the web of North Indian musical and artistic practice. Before we can approach our example, we need to know something about North Indian classical music. It is important to note that this text can only provide a shallow and perfunctory glimpse of a tradition that requires a lifetime of dedication to master. Like their Western counterparts, North Indian classical musicians immerse themselves in their tradition for decades before claiming any sort of authority. Further, as with European classical music, a listener does not need to master the theoretical nuances in order to enjoy a performance. We're going to get into the fundamentals of Indian classical music, starting with the example in question, Raga Madhuvanti, and its connection to what we call raga theory. Raga theory is similar to the idea of scale theory in Western musical theory, but there are some slight differences that are interesting and worth checking out here. The North Indian classical music of today combines a relatively modern instruments and practices with a theoretical system that dates to the 9th century. Here, we will focus on the concept of raga, which is roughly analogous to the scale. Unlike the scale, however, which provides the composer or performer only with a set of pitches and some information about their hierarchy, the first note of the scale, for example, is the most important. We talked about that before, the tonic pitch. However, a raga carries a great weight of information, both musical and extra-musical. Extra-musical meaning having to do with the non-sounding elements. Ragas are used as a basis for fixed compositions, but more often they are explored in an improvised performance, a practice that we will explore below. It is impossible to determine the precise number of ragas in existence. About 500 seem to be in use at any given time, while an individual musician might master a few dozen in their lifetime. We will use Raga Madhuvanti as an example. Raga Madhuvanti contains 7 distinct pitches, just like the Western scale. However, the pitches found in Raga Madhuvanti are not found in any Western mode. If we were to imagine starting from a major scale, the 3rd pitch would be flat, but the 4th would be sharp, creating a large gap between them. In addition, the pitches contained in a raga vary depending on whether one is ascending, going up, or descending, going down. The most important scale degree in Raga Madhuvanti is 1, while the second most important is 5. Madhuvanti is a raga used in Indian classical music. It is a Hindustani music raga, which is reported to have been borrowed into Carnatic music and is structurally similar to Multani. This rag is based on Todi Tat, which is a mode. It is a romantic raga based on the foundation, eternity, and colors of love. Madhu literally means honey. It is a very sweet raga with a very simple philosophy of love and romance. Its Aroha Avarana structure, which is the ascending and descending scale, is as follows. The upward is, these are equivalents, sa, ge, ma, pa, na, sa, and on the bottom, sa, na, di, pa, ma, ga, re, sa. So this is similar to solfege in Western music, but they use different pronunciations or different syllables to represent the pitches in this culture. It is an Adava Sampurna raga, which means 5 notes in the ascending and all 7 notes in the descending scale. So like we learned, if you look at the piano, even if you don't know a whole lot of how the piano works, The easiest place to find the major scale on the piano would be just to play all of the white notes of the piano here. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But as we learned in the previous slide, in this scale, we have a lowered third note. So instead of this, we moved to here. And instead of the fourth note, we raised it up here. So we have this quite large of a gap here between these two notes. This gives the raga its distinctive sound. And again, it has an ascending form and a descending form. So when we hear the melodies going up, we're going to hear them always going from sa, ga, me, pa, ni, sa. But when we go down, we're actually playing through all of the notes. So it has a different upward structure of only 5 notes and a descending structure of all 7 notes. Again, that creates expectations about how this raga Madhuvanti is performed. This video shows the ascending and descending forms of this raga. I would encourage you to watch this video and listen to what that sounds like. This is an interesting image. It's a ragamala portraying Raga Todi, dating from 1591. In this image, she holds a Rudra Veena, which was the most important melody instrument from the 16th to the 19th centuries, but which she has now been replaced by the sitar. The presence of the instrument suggests the sounds of the raga, even though it is unheard. So this is a visual portrayal. This is already more information about performance practice than one can derive from a Western scale, but we have only begun. Each of the pitches indicated above must be precisely tuned, for North Indian music employs microtones, or pitches that fall between the keys on the piano. These must be learned by ear, and are unique to a given raga. Each pitch must also be approached and ornamented in the correct manner, for this is a rich vocabulary of slides, vibratos, and trills. Raga Madhuvanti also contains prescribed resting places for the melody as it develops. Any melody played in Raga Madhuvanti will be further shaped by a vocabulary of typical phrases that identify the raga. Finally, one cannot incorporate any additional pitches without destroying the raga. So it's set in terms of the notes that you are allowed to use when representing this raga. But we have still only begun. It is now time to move on to the extra musical characteristics of Raga Madhuvanti. To begin with, Raga Madhuvanti is used to express gentle, loving, and romantic sentiments. In particular, it communicates the emotion that one feels for one's beloved. It is also considered sweet and playful. The root of the name Madhu translates to honey. The character of the raga is captured in poetry and paintings. Known musical ragas through the verse began in the 14th century, which in turn inspired the miniature paintings of the 16th and 17th centuries. There are no classical representations of Raga Madhuvanti which has developed in the 1930s, but we can still link it to art. Ragas are organized into families known as tat, and Madhuvanti belongs to the Todi tat. Ragas in a family share a variety of musical and extra-musical characteristics. Raga Todi is portrayed as a beautiful woman, the wife of Raga Hindol, who is separated from her lover. She is always surrounded by deer and focuses her attention on the buck, who represents masculine virility. At this point, we've wandered a bit far from our topic, but all of this is relevant to the understanding of Raga Madhuvanti, which is traditionally considered to possess a spiritual existence independent of any performance or description. When we say that Raga Madhuvanti was developed in the 1930s, that is not quite correct. It might be better to say that it was discovered for most musicians. For most musicians would agree that ragas exist whether or not they are named and performed. When a musician begins to perform a raga, they embark upon the lifetime task of becoming acquainted with it, as if it were another human being. Every encounter reveals new facets of the raga, which cannot be fully captured in any single performance. Finally, Raga Madhuvanti, like all ragas, is associated with a specific season and time of day. Raga Madhuvanti is an evening raga that should be performed during the 4th quarter of the day, or roughly between 4 and 8 p.m. It is also considered appropriate for the summer season. At one time, these associations were taken very seriously. The North Indian classical tradition developed in the courts, where musicians played ragas that were suited to the moment. A morning raga for the monsoon season, for example, would be only heard on a monsoon morning. In the courts, musicians played constantly and were therefore able to maintain correlations between ragas and time markers. With the rise of concert life in the 20th century, however, this became impossible, and North Indian classical musicians today generally perform ragas without concern for time or season. Nevertheless, these associations linger. So we've learned about raga theory, the idea of the pitches or the scales of the musical performance. Now we're going to get into tala theory. This has been an overview of raga theory, which concerns the melodic and extra musical contents of a performance. Now moving on, tala theory, which concerns rhythmic content, is equally complex, but we will largely pass over it here due to the fact that it is difficult for untrained listeners to perceive the rhythmic nuances of North Indian classical music. We will note only that a tala is a pattern of beats used in the performance of a raga. The number of beats in a tala can range from 3 to 128, although most contain between 6 and 16 beats. Beats can be strong or weak, and each is characterized by a specific percussive sound. A tala, therefore, is best thought of as a cycle of timbres. This is simple enough, but a drummer will also almost never play this cycle unadorned. Instead, they will improvise complex rhythms over the tala, which exists only in the imagination of the performers and listeners. I always try to explain this to people that tala theory is best explained as a rhythmic cycle set to a number of beats which repeats consistently during a performance. So the cycle is set and it comes back around to beat one of that cycle, whether it be 3 beats or 128 beats, it follows that flow. And I think it is important what they said here, that it is a cycle of timbres. There are some sections that are very heavy in the bass sounds of the drum, and other sections where the bass is actually removed. So we hear this shift within the cycle as well. This is a great video here. It's a tabla solo from tabla legend Pandit Swapan Chowdhury, who was also my teacher. I had a great honor of studying with him when I was in college. The video demonstrates an introductory alap section played by the harmonium to introduce the sounds of the raga. So we'll get to this term a little bit later. The main focus, though, is on the tabla solo, which is set to a 16-beat cycle called teen tal. In this video, the use of a walking individual to the pulse demonstrates the 16-beat cycle. So you'll see that he is playing the drums, the tabla drums in the video, but there's also a video piece to this particular portrayal that someone has walked around a table kind of from an aerial view that shows all 16 steps that correspond with the 16 beats of the teen tal cycle. That's a lot of information. But watch it and I think you'll understand what they're doing. You'll notice too that the musical ideas usually start at the beginning of the cycle, and then when they come around, they tend to finish also on the end of that cycle, oftentimes. Sometimes it might be 2 cycles or 3 cycles. But see if you can follow that logic and listen for how the rhythm is all fitting into this 16-beat tala, which is called teen tal. Very cool video. Now, ragas and talas are not paired up one-to-one, but only specific talas may be used with a given raga. We will be hearing a performance of Raga Madhuvanti with Rupak Tala, which contains 7 beats divided into 3 groups containing 3, 2, and 2 beats respectively. So again, this is a 7-beat tala or 7-beat cycle called Rupak Tala that has 3 sections already to it. It has a group of 3, a group of 2, and then another group of 2 beats. All in all, that makes 7. North Indian classical musicians learn talas by reciting the syllables associated with each beat, which in turn represents that sound of the drum and indicates how it is to be struck to create that sound. So the 7 syllables for the 7 beats of Rupak Tala are tin, tin, na, din, na, din, na. So we can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 beats, and each one is a different sound that can also be played on the drum. The tin sounds are without bass, and the din sounds are with the sound of the bass sounding drum. So you'll see it sounds lighter in the beginning and then has a little bit more weight because of the bass toward the end part of the cycle. You can also see this is the group of 3, tin, tin, na, and the groups of 2 are din, na, din, na. So the whole thing, tin, tin, na, din, na, din, na. You can even hear with my voice that the din has a lot more bass in it than just saying tin. This video here shows the Rupak Tala cycle, all 7 beats. The most common percussion instrument in North Indian classical music is the tabla, which is a pair of small drums, one a bit larger than the other, that are played with the hands. Tin indicates a resonant stroke with the right hand, while na is a damped stroke with the right hand, and din is a resonant stroke with both hands. An accomplished player will be careful to use the correct fingerings with the appropriate force in exactly the right spot on the drum head. So to get all of these different sounds, tin, na, and din, you have to make sure that you're striking the drum with the right finger in the correct place of the drum. These drums have a tremendous potential of sound that we don't always hear on the drums that we might be more accustomed to. Here we see again the tabla drum. This is a great video that shows the tabla in action yet again. And with this example, you're going to see, again, an example of the 16-beat cycle, but this is a tabla solo again. We are finally ready to consider a modern performance of Raga Madhuvanti. We will begin with the instruments, one of which, the tabla, has already been introduced. All North Indian classical music is performed over a drone, which usually consists of the 2 most important notes in the raga. In the case of Raga Madhuvanti, as noted above, those are the 1st and 5th scale degrees. Do, so. The drone is most often performed on an instrument called a tanpura. This long-necked flute is almost completely hollow and therefore extremely resonant. It has no frets and cannot be used to play melodies. Instead, the performer lightly plucks each of the 4 strings in turn to create a sustained drone. The tanpura is most often played by an apprentice of the soloist. So again, this is not a solo instrument by any means. It is used only to produce these drone sounds in the background of the soloists. Much more of an accompaniment instrument. Now, the next instrument, the sitar, is capable of producing its own drone, but it is a much more complicated instrument and is used primarily to perform the raga. Today, the sitar is the most common North Indian melodic instrument. Here it is featured here. Similar to the tanpura, but you can see that it has frets similar to guitar frets that allows it to play all the different notes that the tanpura cannot. The sitar was made famous in the second half of the 20th century by the virtuoso Ravi Shankar, who influenced the Beatles. We'll talk about them in chapter 8 in that connection, and frequently performed at popular music festivals, including Woodstock, which we will discuss in chapter 7. The sitar, however, is not a particularly ancient instrument, dating only to the 18th century. Like the tanpura, the sitar has a hollow neck and is highly resonant. Both instruments also produce a light, metallic buzzing sound that is essential to the timbre. Unlike the tanpura, the sitar has large arched frets. We can see them right here. Melodies are often played on the strings that run across them. These strings can either be pressed down, shortening the length of the string, or pulled to the side, increasing the tension on the string. Both actions change the note produced when the string is plucked, and they can be combined to produce the effect of sliding between pitches. Sitars, in fact, have 3 different types of strings. The top 3 are used to play the melody. Below these are are 3 or 4 strings that are used to produce the drone. The most interesting, however, are the 12 to 14 sympathetic strings that run down the neck behind the frets. These strings are tuned to the pitches of the raga and resonate when the same pitches are played on the melody strings, thereby contributing to the vibrancy of the instrument's sound. They can also be strummed. So these strings that they're talking about, sympathetic strings, are typically not played by the performer in the traditional sense of being plucked, but they are there to vibrate naturally without being touched even when the same note is played. We call this sympathetic vibration, which means that when one pitch is played at the exact same frequency as one of these sympathetic strings, it causes it to vibrate naturally without any additional effort from the player. It gives the instrument an incredible sound. Mastering the sitar is comparable in difficulty to mastering the nuances of the raga and tala systems. Traditionally, aspiring musicians committed themselves to a guru or a teacher at a young age. The student would move in with the guru and become part of the family, completing household tasks in return for musical guidance. Although this system has been largely replaced by private lessons and music schools in the European model, both of the musicians we will discuss here learned their craft immersively in the traditional way. One is Ravi Shankar, who was apprenticed to sarod player Alauddin Khan, and the other is Anushka Shankar, who learned from her father. Ravi Shankar, who lived from 1920 to 2012, is remembered as the performer who popularized North Indian music in the West. He began his tours of European and the United States in 1956. He began his regular tours of Europe and the United States in 1956. At concerts, he focused on educating audiences about his instrument, the sitar, and the North Indian classical tradition, winning fans in the process. In the 1960s, he began to form relationships with popular musicians, including George Harrison of the Beatles. He was invited to participate in both of the major popular musical festivals of the 1960s, the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival and the 1969 Aquarian Exposition, which is better known as Woodstock. His influence can be heard on a number of rock albums from the era, including the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Ravi's daughter, Anushka Shankar, was born in London in 1981, when Ravi was 61 years old. She began training with him at the age of 7, and was soon appearing beside him on stage playing the tanpura. Anushka gave her first solo performance at the age of 13, making her first studio recording shortly after. Although she is certainly a master of the North Indian classical tradition, Anushka has been primarily interested in cross-cultural collaborations, and has released a series of albums that explore the connections between different musical traditions. Like her father, she has also maintained connection with the world of popular music. Her most frequent collaborator is singer Norah Jones, who also happens to be her half-sister. We will focus on Anushka's rendition of Raga Madhuvanti, made live at a Carnegie Hall concert in 2000. Ravi's recording will serve for comparison, for although both are performances of Raga Madhuvanti, they are quite different and cannot be considered to represent the same piece. In the North Indian tradition, the roles of composer and performer are essentially indistinguishable. A player composes in the process of performing a raga, improvising melodic motifs and shapes drawn from a lifetime of studying compositions from their gurus. At the same time, the identity of the raga is paramount, and two performances of the same raga are therefore expected to communicate similar emotional and expressive content. Both recordings are considerably shorter than a traditional performance, which might extend to an hour or more. This is typical of the modern era, for audiences desire variety and expect to hear several ragas on concert. Both recordings, however, exhibit the traditional structure of a raga performance, which is in two large parts, alap and jala. In the first part of a performance, termed the alap, Anushka introduces the notes of Raga Madhuvanti. This is done slowly and deliberately over the course of nearly 10 minutes. She establishes the notes in order, ornamenting them with characteristic slides and melodic fragments. Because the notes of the raga must be presented from lowest to highest, her playing begins in the low range and gradually extends into the high. Once Anushka has established all of the notes, she gradually introduces a regular pulse into the music. This pulse quickens and she begins to play with increased rhythmic activity. As a result, the alap, which begins in a meditative mood, concludes with breathtaking excitement. So this is a video that just focuses on the alap section. It is very slow, meditative in a way, but when you really know what she is doing in establishing the raga, the sensation and the character of Raga Madhuvanti in this case, it becomes quite interesting. You can also hear that she's establishing the notes one by one as she broadens out the melody to show all of the notes of the raga in both their ascending and descending forms like we already discussed. So again, pause this video and listen to her alap of Raga Madhuvanti. The second part of the performance is called the jala. Its beginning is marked by the entrance of the tabla, which establishes the tala rhythmic cycle. In this case, we are hearing the 7-beat rupak tala as previously described. The role of the sitar also changes at this point. While Anushka has been freely improvising thus far, now she plays a fixed melody called a gut. Such melodies are usually traditional, and they can be heard in many different performances of the same raga. For the remainder of the jala, Anushka improvises using fragments of the gut according to the rules associated with Raga Madhuvanti. One can recognize the gut from time to time as Anushka works it into the fabric of her playing. As in the alap, she increases the rhythmic complexity and virtuosity of her improvisations as she builds to the exciting conclusion. So this you'll see a very dramatic shift that going into the jala section, we see the establishment of the tala. In this case, it's the 7-beat rupak tala. In the alap section on the previous slide, everything was much more, I would say, free time, open in terms of the rhythmic meter. We don't really have a rhythmic cycle established yet. When we get into the jala, things are more steady to the beat, and we hear much more interplay of rhythm in the creativity of the musicians. So hopefully you've watched Anushka Shankar's jala section of the same raga, Raga Madhuvanti. We're going to move now to a brief consideration of Ravi Shankar's performance of Raga Madhuvanti, which reveals the flexibility that characterizes the North Indian classical tradition. So like we've already discussed, they're both playing from the same raga that has the same basic rules to it, so to say, but because of his own creativity and his lived experience, the way that he expresses it is going to be quite different. And again, he's probably played this many, many times. He might play it differently the next time that he played it. His alap is very brief, less than 2 minutes, in comparison with Anushka's 10-minute performance. He establishes the pitches of the raga much more quickly, and his playing is lively from the start. At the beginning of the jala, he plays a completely different gut, which then leads into an extremely long improvisation, 20 minutes. That, because it is founded on a different gut, sounds nothing like Anushka's. In short, the two recordings of Raga Madhuvanti have very little in common. They are not, in a Western sense, recordings of the same piece of music. They are, however, recordings of the same raga, which brings us back to the question that opened this chapter. How can sound tell a story? An experienced listener will hear these two performances as both commuting aspects of the essential character of Raga Madhuvanti. Neither of these performances tells a specific story, containing a narrative, events, or characters, like we encountered in Berlioz's Fantastical Symphony. However, each is decidedly dramatic insofar as it engages with and elucidates the extra-musical character of the raga. A listener will know that Raga Madhuvanti is associated with the evening and it expresses romantic love. They might also be familiar with the poetry or paintings that have captured and contributed to the raga's character. Each performance, therefore, adds to the greater narrative of Raga Madhuvanti, a narrative that stretches across generations and continents. So here is Ravi Shankar's recording of the Alap and the Jala section of Raga Madhuvanti. Again, the same mode, but a different performance, yet they are connected in that they tell us the same character. They tell us the same associations that this raga has had throughout history. Now, this example also presents an opportunity to discuss the non-universality of programmatic musical expression. Some questions to ask. Do you hear these performances as expressing the sentiment of romantic love? Do you hear them as playful? Do you connect them with the evening or the summer? Do you even hear them as communicating the same emotional content as one another? The answer may very well be no. Most music communicates meaning within a cultural context. In this case, that meaning is determined by the listener's familiarity with North Indian classical music, with the raga system in general, and with Raga Madhuvanti in particular. A lifetime of exposure to this music will lead one to make the correct emotional connections. Those emotions, however, are not inherent in the music and not obvious to every listener. This is true of every musical tradition. Okay, so we've come to the end of this chapter. I'm just going to show you, this is one more slide, which if you're interested in Indian rhythm in particular, these are two videos. They both actually have the same video within them. And they both show another example of Rupak Tal, 7-beat cycle. This one shows singing of what we call Kanakal, which is a singing of the Indian classical music tradition. It shows the rhythmic complexity, and they use their voices to represent these rhythms. They're using similar sounds that you might see used on the tabla drums. This video on the right was made by a friend of mine, Amir Usman, who actually transcribed and wrote out his own part to be played on the tenor drums that could accompany this video. So it kind of shows that cross-collaboration between cultures and also just the intricacy of this type of rhythm. Okay, so thank you for following along with me. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter. It ties into our broader topic about program music, which relates to project number 1, that I hope you'll have some fun working on and expressing some ideas about program music. From there, I'll leave you to it. Take care and I hope that you have a great week.